Good evening, everyone. My name is Kennedy Jawoko, and I'm a journalism professor at Seneca College in Toronto. I wish to begin by saying how delighted I am to be speaking here tonight at the Walrus Talks. I also wish to thank everyone who helped organize this. My message tonight is not academic. In fact, it's even not original. It's a very straightforward message. As the next generation of leaders, global leaders rather, begin to emerge, the cliched narrative about Africa must change to allow for a more engaged, informed, and shared global citizenship. The narratives must include both success and failures taking place across Africa. Because I believe that stories shape perceptions, and perceptions do shape behavior. Let me explain for a minute. In May of 2000, The Economist magazine had a screaming headline, very bold in fact. "Hopeless Africa," it screamed. Well, inside the pages of The Economist magazine, the picture of Africa was painted as a place of pathology, death, and warlords. The Economist suggested that for reasons deeply buried in African culture, Africa is inclined to being a place of brutality. Well, fast forward 2013. This time, a different title from the same magazine. "A hopeful continent," it screamed. From hopeless to hopeful, and yes, these days to rising Africa. You must have seen that. Well, Africans have been calling for a considered coverage of their continent for some time now. Stories of success proliferate. Africa is home to 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world: Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Rwanda, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and yes, the Democratic Republic of Congo. The African Development Bank chief economist says this trend is, quote, "unstoppable." Africa has become an important consumer market. Just ask China if you're in doubt. Average incomes, by the way, in Africa rose by 30% in the last decade. Africa is witnessing a boom in mobile banking. In his book, Abundance, American entrepreneur Peter Diamandis writes that a Maasai man standing on the Kenyan plains with an ordinary cell phone has better access to mobile communication than, listen to this, President Ronald Reagan had in the mid-1980s. Now, if that same Maasai man has access to a smartphone, he has wider access to information online than President Bill Clinton had in the mid-1990s. Just think about that for a second. Well, the surge in the use of digital tools has been dizzying across Africa, leading to one Silicon Valley commentator to refer to Kenya as the Silicon Savannah. Many farmers across Africa can now receive latest market prices with a single text message. Moreover, the pervasiveness of cell phones has created a new breed of African entrepreneurs. They're scattered all over across African cities, as far apart from Lagos to Nairobi to Gaborone. And yes, that's the capital city of Botswana, a middle-income African country. The new breed of African leaders I speak of tonight is the vendor selling airtime all across Africa. What's more, these liberation technology tools are transforming political debate and civic advocacy. Africa's middle class has become central to international development discourse. I don't want to stand here and paint a rosy perspective of Africa, because that would be intellectually and morally dishonest. Life still remains a winter of despair for the millions of people who do not easily fit into the change narrative I'm advocating tonight. Significant challenges remain. Weak public institutions in some countries in Africa render people vulnerable to public health concerns. Instability in South Sudan, a country that I've visited several times, continues to unravel the gains that have been made since independence. The declines in global oil, for instance, threaten growth in countries like Nigeria and Angola. These challenges, ladies and gentlemen, are real, but so are the progress that are being made on the continent. Focusing on positive trends is crucial to beginning to recalibrate the story of Africa to one more balanced between progress and setbacks. And to my mind, there are three ways to avoid the trap of pity. First, it is critical to acknowledge the centrality of Africa's leadership in crisis response. In most emergencies, anyone taking a closer look will see African leadership on display. Again, think about the nurses and doctors caring for those stricken with Ebola crisis in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. But most Canadians would not know this because those interviewed on most news programs about Africa are non-Africans. News producers usually feel that Canadians need someone from Canada to provide context. Well, an anomaly that is not usually extended to the coverage of Europe. A second way to counter the negative stereotype is to present a spring of hope as much as we are presenting the despair on the continent. Most Canadians will not realize that the news they consume is in part driven by this traditional media mantra that says, if it bleeds, it leads. So how would most Canadians know about political and economic progress in Africa if that story is not being told? Well, a third way to counter the negative narrative is to avoid, or rather to provide a bit of comparative historical context. Most Canadians would not necessarily realize that African countries are 5 or 6 decades old as independent nation states. Most Canadians would not make the connection that it took centuries of wars and genocide in Europe to settle on the modern nation states such as France, Italy, or Germany. The point here is that designing constitutions for divided societies is challenging. It's difficult. Canada went through this as well. Just ask the founder nations, the English and the French, and the wars that were fought on these soils. Well, Kenya, a neighboring country from where I was born in Uganda, is just over 60 years old, has more than 70 distinct ethnic groups, which includes, by the way, the Luo people, whose famous son is President Barack Obama of the US. My point tonight is this. There is a way to talk about the diversity of Africa without painting a rosy perspective or reinforcing insulting stereotypes. To paraphrase Charles Dickens, it is the best of times and the worst of times for Africa. And there are complex and important reasons why both are simultaneously true. Thank you.